The last century has been one of unprecedented worldwide growth in terms of population, industry, and urbanization. The global population has exploded from 1.5 billion at the beginning of the 20th century to well over 7 billion currently. As always in human history, this expansive population growth has necessitated massive agricultural growth to feed everyone. While the scale of agriculture has increased proportionately, this has mainly been made possible by the development of new technologies like artificial fertilizers, refrigeration technology, and intricate transportation and delivery systems that allow huge amounts of food to be shipped across vast distances quickly. These technologies have radically shifted the nature of agriculture from the common pursuit of most people on Earth to a hugely industrialized system run by a tiny minority of producers. For example, in America, which exports more food and agricultural products than any other country in the world, only 2% of the population work in agricultural production. This shift away from agrarian-based societies has also transformed the demographics of the world, as over half of all people on Earth now live in cities, with developed nations averaging closer to 75%. Although the urbanization and agricultural revolutions of the past century are truly unprecedented, they have some historical parallels which should be cause for concern, especially as the long-term effects of these new systems becomes more and more evident. During its golden age, one of the first truly metropolitan and international civilizations, the classical city-state of Athens, achieved a high degree of wealth and power by its development of land and maritime trade systems, urban market centers, and specialized industry for mass production of goods. As historian Will Durant noted about this period, quote, "In one century, Athens moves from household economy, wherein each household makes nearly all that it needs, to urban economy, wherein each town makes nearly all that it needs, to international economy, where each state is dependent upon imports and must make exports to pay for them." End quote. As a result of this intricate dependence, when the Spartan fleet wiped out the Athenian fleet during the Peloponnesian War, all of Athens' tribute from vassal states dried up, her trade ground to a halt, and the city was instantly crippled by famine. A similar fate awaited imperial Rome of the 5th century, which had grown accustomed to tribute and trade supplying the needs of sustenance. A city of over 1 million people, most inhabitants of Rome by this time had lived for centuries in an exclusively urban environment, completely removed from and unfamiliar with the natural processes of basic food production. As water was piped in from numerous aqueducts and a continuous stream of ships brought grain from Egypt, the Roman urbanites existed in a comfortable and leisurely bubble of security. However, when Alaric and his Goths laid siege to Rome at the beginning of the 5th century, famine ruled the day, and in short order the citizens of Rome were resorting to cannibalism. A century later, the aqueducts were broken and empty, and the few thousands of citizens left living there built their houses out of stone scavenged from ancient monuments, and grazed their livestock in the abandoned imperial palaces. The virulent virtue, industriousness, and national spirit of the agrarian Greeks and Romans was diluted and eventually dissipated by their wholehearted adoption of urban life, and their ever greater dependency on more and more remote and elaborate food supply systems. When these systems were interrupted by war or crisis, these once resilient civilizations that had weathered so many sieges, invasions, and crises in previous ages crumbled and capitulated. The history of the United States closely resembles in many ways the decline of the great classical empires, from vigorous agrarian civilizations to fragile urban masses entirely dependent on tributary food supplies. In the years immediately following the American Revolution, fully 90% of the population lived and worked on farms, immediately involved in producing the staples needed by their families and the broader society. A significant percentage of Americans at the beginning of the 19th century owned productive property, either in land or in trade tools and workshops. By 1900, the percentage of the population involved in agriculture had dropped below 40%, and currently the percentage is so small that there are more Americans incarcerated than there are farmers. This massive urbanization in America was mostly made possible by two factors: the invention of chemical fertilizers using nitrogen captured from the air, a process developed in 1908 by Fritz Haber, and the petroleum-based shipping networks of truck delivery. Nitrogen fertilizer replenishes the chemicals in soil used by growing crops, a process which was traditionally achieved by some balance of composting organic matter, animal manure, and allowing fields to fallow periodically. This new method was slow to take hold in the U.S., But after World War II, the U.S. had a number of gigantic nitrogen plants, which had been used to manufacture bombs, that now needed some other outlet for their product. Nitrogen-based fertilizers swiftly became the norm as a fast and cheap alternative to traditional soil building techniques, and nowadays the agriculture industry is entirely based on it. This has led to the replacement of smallhold farms by huge industrial corporate farms, and in a single generation food production in the U.S. went from mostly family-owned local enterprises to these high-tech corporate food factories. Companies rely on centralized production plants, which ship immense quantities of product all over the country via trucks, and it is now normal for Americans to purchase food products that were grown and packaged thousands of miles away. The environmental damage caused by this modern industrial agriculture system and its long-term unsustainability have been well documented, but its social consequences are equally dire in terms of how quickly millions of people have become entirely dependent on complicated and remote systems for even the most basic needs of sustaining life. As localized catastrophes like Hurricane Katrina have demonstrated, if anything interrupts the delicate equilibrium of these systems, it instantly leaves huge numbers of people and entire regions with little or no life-sustaining resources. What would happen if these systems were disrupted on a national scale? It's not a stretch of the imagination to expect something similar to the desperation of the ancient Romans during Alaric's siege, replayed in hundreds of cities across a continent. Such a scenario need not be the case, though. Already awareness of the fragility of this food dependence is growing, and numerous examples of successful, sustainable alternatives have been presented and are gaining notoriety. Joel Salatin, a leading spokesman for agricultural reform, manages a large-scale family farm in Virginia that feeds 6,000 people and supplies local restaurants and markets within a 3-hour driving radius, all without using any chemicals. He uses innovative livestock rotation methods and complementary cycles of crops and animals, achieving superior quality and quantity of product than many comparably sized industrial farms. On a much smaller scale, homesteaders like the Gervais family in California have demonstrated that it is possible to produce all the food for a family with surplus on a normal-sized residential lot of less than 1/4 acre. With the exception of the Victory Gardens of World War II, this small-scale and urban approach to food production has not been very widely adopted in the U.S., but a similar practice called dacha gardening has long been a staple of food production in Russia, and it greatly mitigated the effects of frequent food shortages during the Soviet era. Even now, more than half of Russian produce is still grown in these small family dacha plots. All of these examples demonstrate that even though high-tech industrialized agriculture is the mainstream in developed nations, it need not be a monopoly. To grow a more robust, resilient future, American citizens should be encouraged to learn and get involved in food production wherever they can. Even if they only have access to a small urban yard plot, with knowledge and determination, they can still take control of a significant part of their food needs. In time, a widespread familiarity with and investment in producing food would minimize the need for ecologically destructive shipping networks and rekindle some of the self-reliance and resiliency that once were the hallmarks of the American people.